Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It is 4:45, and I am speaking to you from London. My name is Laura Stirling, and I'm the Senior Clinical Specialist at Regeneris Labs, but I'm joined today by Mark Bennett from Entire Wellbeing, who you can see on your screen right now. Mark is a registered nutritional therapist who specializes in complex chronic conditions with a lot of focus around autoimmunity. And so for us today, it's not a CPD type event. It's really, we've been listening to your feedback as clinicians. We had lots of requests for more training, more information, and we thought we'd mix it with not just always being test focused, but also to get clinical pearls from some of our wonderful practitioners. So today is a combination of both. It's clinical pearls from Mark about gluten and all that comes with that, and also to introduce you all to a product called Gluten Detect, which is essentially a bit like a pregnancy test to see whether you've been exposed to gluten. But I think it's a popular topic, so we've got masses of people on this call. And I think it's particularly popular because gluten is such a hot topic for us all. We're also widely affected by problems associated with gluten in the clinic, be that IBS type symptoms or all the way through to celiac, and then more and more so affected extraintestinal symptoms. So anything from depression or skin complaints or energy imbalances. So things that can't be explained by like a FODMAP reason for gluten being a problem, for example, ways that go far beyond just the confines of the gut and how damaging it can be. So Mark, thank you for joining us.
That's a pleasure indeed.
And it's very nice to see you here. And so firstly, let me ask about your practice, Entire Wellbeing. What do you specialize in, and what do you see most clinically?
Okay, Laura. Essentially, I specialize in conditions that are chronic, like most nutritional therapists do, but I tend to have a focus on the autoimmune aspect of chronic disease, which, as most of the viewers will know, consists of 80 plus conditions. And in fact, the number of conditions that are classified as autoimmune are growing on pretty much a weekly, monthly basis. So autoimmunity is viewed as probably the single largest classification of diseases that are chronic diseases, because actually when you start looking at things like cardiovascular disease and cancer, they have an autoimmune component. And even type 2 diabetes is now considered as having an autoimmune component. So, you know, we originally thought that type 1 is the autoimmune version and type 2 is the non-autoimmune version, but actually autoimmunity seems to be putting its head up in all kinds of places. So autoimmunity is what I specialize in, and that's really because I've had an interest ever since doing my degree. I did my degree dissertation on the pathogenesis of autoimmunity and the connection to the digestive system, which was a fascinating subject to have worked on. And I'm using my original training and the knowledge that I've gleaned through listening to doctors that I really respect, primarily in America, to actually help clients in clinic with autoimmune conditions. And that ranges across the board from, I see a lot of officially diagnosed celiacs who are not getting better, and that's quite a big subject, especially to do with Gluten Detect. I mean, this is a huge area when you start looking at the stats on why a huge swathe of officially diagnosed celiacs just don't get better on a gluten-free diet. And, you know, my point here is it good enough to simply exclude gluten if you are a celiac? And the answer is no, but, you know, that's another discussion. But, well, we will talk about some of those points in a minute. But yeah, so other conditions I work on are chronic fatigue, a lot of chronic fatigue work, which often is connected to, by the way, undiagnosed celiac disease, ME, obviously, and dementia.
Wow, okay, so huge broad scope. I joke sometimes with clinicians that I speak to, like, where have all those blood sugar imbalance people gone that we used to see, you know, 10 years ago? It's just, I think our role is getting so much more complex, and we're just seeing all of these things that are not necessarily particularly well managed in other areas of health. So so I agree, huge area, and I see a lot of autoimmune patients as well. But so with looking at the triad of autoimmunity, so if you're taking genetic susceptibility to some form of autoimmune condition combined with intestinal permeability as a huge topic in itself, and then all of these environmental stresses. A lot of the stresses we can't do a huge amount about by the time you've got an autoimmune condition, but obviously the food things we can. So how do you feel about the rise in gluten intolerance and gluten sensitivity?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there is definitely an upward trend in terms of people that are reacting to things. And there's probably many reasons as to why that happens. I mean, the research suggests there's a fourfold increase in celiac disease in the past 50 years. Now, is that because of the use of pesticides? I mean, a big subject that is very often not discussed is what we actually spray on these grains. Okay.
Yeah, often just before they're harvested as well.
Well, exactly. So crop desiccation is actually something that is advocated in the UK because typically we have wet summers, so the farmer will get 10% more yield from their crop by doing crop desiccation with glyphosate. And as we know, these compounds are probably not that good for humans. And we certainly are thinking or starting to see what we call the production of neoantigens, new molecules that the body has never seen. And this is the issue with autoimmunity, is that when you think of the toxic load in our environment, 85,000 chemicals introduced into the environment since the end of the Second World War, and only a handful have ever been tested on human health. And I would argue we're actually the lab rats right now. We're the guinea pig, we're the rats, we're the ones that are actually being tested on. So when you start looking at these things and you start looking at how synergistically they work together, they individually, they may not be a problem, but then when they actually join together, they really become an issue. And our bodies have got to deal with this chemical assault. That's forgetting the gluten in terms of gluten and the fact it's been hybridized and hybridized and hybridized. So if you look at ancient, wheat, just taking wheat, 14 chromosomes, einkorn wheat, tall, wispy wheat growing in the wild. And now we have dwarf wheat. And of course, dwarf wheat has been created for very specific reasons to feed more people. There's a lot of people on this planet of ours. And we need to feed 7 billion mouths. And obviously grains are a huge part of diet. So this is where, dwarf wheat's been obviously done for that reason. Short stems, higher yield from the heads. But the thing is, we've changed the chromosome content from 14 to 42. The difference between myself and yourself, Laura, is one chromosome. What happens when you add 28 into the mix? So, we're creating lots of things that our bodies have just never seen before. And is it any wonder that we are starting to see we are seeing an explosion in chronic conditions that are potentially mediated by inappropriate immune response?
I think a lot of the pesticide use, not that this has been necessarily proven yet, but it does concern me about not necessarily its direct effect on us as human vertebrates, but on our microbiome and that whole balance as well. Because it seems that there's such a strong link in the gut. It's the loss of diversity and things around that point is also pretty alarming. So with why do you think it's so important to correctly identify gluten sensitivity, and what do you use for that?
Okay, well, gluten-related disorders is the sort of umbrella term, okay, for celiac disease, non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and wheat allergy, okay. Now, as probably all the viewers know, that celiac disease is the autoimmune aspect, okay, of that umbrella term. There is also a new term or new kid on the block, which is interesting, called non-celiac wheat sensitivity, which some really interesting work done by Dr. Armin Alidini in July 2016, and he's identifying this new condition, which basically sits above non-celiac gluten sensitivity. But non-celiac wheat sensitivity is actually people reacting immunologically to the whole grain, or maybe the FODMAPs, or maybe the benzodiazepines in the wheat, okay, which actually do exist naturally, which maybe has a sort of connection with why some people have problems coming off these things.
Yeah, right.
I mean, seriously, I mean, it could be part of it, or the lectins, okay. But we're focusing on gluten here, and gluten is a huge problem, and I see it probably in some respects more than an individual or practitioner working in another field, because autoimmunity is driven so much by gluten, inappropriate responses. And we're talking specifically about the zonulin pathway, tearing down the barrier, the intestinal barrier, the gaps in the tight junction performance, and actually leakiness between the cells. So instantly, if you have raised zonulin levels, you are leaking between the cells. And of course, if you're leaking between the cells, you are letting things through that you shouldn't be letting through. So if you then look at gluten-related disorders as a general term, as a general umbrella, what is it that actually connects all these different aspects of gluten-related disorders together is the inability to break down the protein structure in those grains. So if you're not breaking them down properly, you are then going to start fermenting them. You start causing inflammation. Maybe pathogenic bacteria starts growing on the back of those imbalances. Then you start creating LPS, exhaust of pathogenic bacteria, lipopolysaccharides, which cause inflammation and can then cause leakiness between the cells and through the cells. And as you know, there are tests out there that measure for LPS through the cells and immunological responses, both across the IgA, IgG, and IgM aspects to see what's going on. But zonulin is a really big one. So to answer your question directly, anyone who's autoimmune, I would argue anybody who's autoimmune, no matter whether they are or not officially reacting to gluten from the point of view of testing, and whether they are a celiac or a non-celiac gluten sensitive, I would argue would do themselves a lot of favors by cutting out gluten purely because of the zonulin pathway.
Yeah, agreed. And I think now with access to tests like Cyrex and things, you can depict that so much more clearly than you could before. I think, what are your thoughts around the limitations, I guess, of conventional testing for celiac or non-gluten sensitivity? Because you touched on it already with regards to, I was in lectures and things, it's not like being pregnant. You're either celiac or you're not. There is a huge spectrum. So how do you assess that when people say, oh, well, I've been tested for celiac, but...
It happens, it's a really good point, and it happens time and time again. I've had a client in this afternoon, lots of digestive dysfunction, and I asked the question, so have you been tested for celiac disease? Yes, it came back negative. We know that the NHS test for celiac disease, if you are a full-blown celiac, presenting with really quite significant villus atrophy, is likely to pick up, is very sensitive and is likely to pick up the issue. But the thing is, you don't just wake up one morning with full villus atrophy. The damage tends to happen over decades, over a long period of time. Don't forget, this is one of the most common lifelong disorders in North America and Europe, with only 1 in 8 celiacs ever being diagnosed. These numbers are shocking. They are shocking. The misery and the misery that's created by these conditions is really huge. I know we talk about it as being 1 to 2% of the population, but if you think about 1 to 2% of the global population, that's an awful lot of people suffering. And the fact that the majority of them will never, ever know. And by the way, you do not have to have overt symptoms in order to be a celiac. This is, I think, is where one of the biggest issue is that with all due respect to the medical doctors out there, the allopathic doctors, they're looking for the classic abdominal cramping, diarrhea, failure to thrive, all that stuff. And you don't have to present like that. In fact, now it's more likely you're going to present with neurological issues than you are actually with gut issues, okay? So it's a big one. Less than 50% of celiacs actually overtly present with diarrhea and abdominal cramping. It could be constipation. It could be, as you said, it could be anything. It could be dementia. It could be brain fog. It could be joint pain. It could be, actually, there are 300 conditions that have been linked to celiac disease. It's quite remarkable. Even enamel defects on your teeth or mouth ulcers. This is big. So when it comes to the standard test, going back to the question, it's hugely misguided, because if a doctor does a celiac panel on you and the result comes back, which can do 7 times out of 10 with a false negative, and they turn around and say, you're not a celiac, you can carry on eating gluten. Is that really the case? Because you might be on the spectrum, you may be starting to destroy the villi in the small intestine, And that is actually dangerous. I mean, this is a dangerous condition. This is a life-threatening condition. I would argue that, this is not just a minor intolerance to gluten. This is connected potentially to very significant chronic conditions. Look at osteoporosis, maybe cardiovascular disease. Look at dementia. Is it any wonder? It's a disease of malabsorption. If you're not going to absorb your nutrients properly, how on earth, even if somebody's eating a reasonable diet, and let's face it, most people don't even eat a reasonable diet. So if you are eating a reasonable diet and you're still eating a bit of gluten and you happen to be a celiac, you are still going to potentially not absorb your nutrients properly. So what does one do? Well, you use labs such as Cyrex. Cyrex, obviously, Array 3 is a fabulous test. It's not a diagnostic test, but it gives a really good understanding as to what is going on. And of course, the problem with the NHS test is that they're looking at transglutaminase 2 primarily, IgA, and of course, a lot of celiacs, their IgA function is suboptimal anyway.
Yeah, so that already
the immune function is already knocked back. So then what happens? Then you should, and you do often see, sometimes you see doctors' results coming back where they test the IgA function, which is good to see because they're trying to measure, how is that reacting? So therefore, is the result actually relevant? But what about transglutaminase 3? What about 6? 3 in the skin, 6 primarily in the central nervous system, in the brain. What about the other immunogenic peptides? I mean, research suggests that there are over 50 immunostimulatory peptides that can cause problems. Well, we're measuring one, if we're lucky. It's ridiculous. It's like, well, okay, it may be the ringleader, but you might not be reacting to alpha gliadin, you might be reacting to gamma gliadin, omega gliadin, gluteomorphine. It doesn't, the list goes on.
Yeah. And there's no real formal diagnosis or classification for NCGS. And I think people sort of think, oh yeah, you're gluten intolerant. But before we started this, you were telling me about the JAMA article. Will you repeat those stats? Because they are unbelievable.
Absolutely. I mean, I was really surprised because this was something that I came across only very recently myself. And I think the point here is that we view celiac disease as being relatively significant. Okay, it's an autoimmune issue. It could be, and most people, when I say it to people who are lay people, I say, celiac disease, oh yeah, that's quite serious, isn't it? You've got to do something about it.
Yeah. But
if you mention non-celiac gluten sensitivity, it's just a bit of an intolerance, isn't it? Of course, it's not an intolerance, it's a sensitivity, but that's another discussion. But the point is that, those terms are used wrongly. But the point is that it is actually very serious. And I think this is a really key point for this test, the Gluten Detect, because the study, as I said, you talked about the Journal of American Medical Association, they reviewed 351,000 biopsies, okay? And the results were staggering. So celiac disease individuals had a 39% increased risk of early mortality, according to the results, and non-celiac gluten sensitive had a 72% increased risk of early mortality. I mean, that is unbelievable. Now, it isn't unbelievable.
Unbelievable. I mean, I think that's staggering, that percentage.
But I mean, it is staggering, Laura, but goes on to be even worse. It then says anti-nuclear antibodies, which is basically measures autoimmunity, were raised 24%. So 24% of the celiac group had raised anti-nuclear antibodies. And with the non-celiac gluten-sensitive group, it was 46%. So you're actually more likely to develop an autoimmune condition elsewhere in the body with non-celiac gluten sensitivity than you are with celiac disease. Yeah. I think that's absolutely staggering. That's a high-powered study as well. I mean, it's thousands, hundreds of thousands of biopsies. Yeah. It's incredible stuff. So, we really do misjudge how serious this is. And remember also, 22% of celiacs are asymptomatic. There are no symptoms at all. So when you do an endoscopy on them to measure the health of their villi, they have villus atrophy going on, even with no overt issues going on at all.
Yeah, I've had a number of people who have been picked up, well, a small number of people actually, but they've been picked up because of other problems, which I think is very common, like they're anemic and they just can't get they can't get their iron stores up, or there's some other thing that has eventually got them to a diagnosis, but they've been, as you say, pretty suboptimally well for really seriously long time. So one of my questions, which I think you've basically answered, is why is it so important to correctly identify gluten reactivity? But I think I think the JAMA article has pretty much, a paper has pretty much proven why that's so important.
It does.
And then, so once identified, how do you get compliance? Like, what are the areas that you ask people to really focus on, and where do you find that people find it difficult?
Well, that's a big question, because we know as practitioners that eliminating gluten from the diet is actually, it's easy to say but very hard to do. 100%. And remember, it takes only 10 milligrams, per day of this substance to reignite the immune system. Yeah. I don't know how many milligrams are in a slice of bread, but I think it's in the thousands. Yeah.
Wow.
So, it's
10 milligrams reignites the immune system. Okay, so that starts off an antibody.
Yeah. Now, there are various studies and there are various things, but the general consensus from what I've read is that 10 to 15 milligrams is what you can get away with. But remember, 1 to 5% of the celiac population are refractory. And refractory means that they can't tolerate even that amount of gluten. So when foods are labeled gluten-free, which I really feel they should not be labeled gluten-free, because they're not gluten-free, they're less than 20 parts per million, which is not gluten-free.
Yeah.
And there are apparently very low gluten foods, which apparently get labeled in Europe. Okay, so that's like 100 parts per million, I believe. Yeah, but we don't tend to see it over here. No. So less than, it's basically what they're saying is no more than 100 parts per million. But this is a big subject, because the problem is gluten is in so many products. And of course, I'm just reading a list here. This is just a general list here. So malt extract, baked beans, supplements. Supplements is a big one. The number of times I see officially diagnosed celiacs walking into my clinic saying, well, I take these things. And of course, a lot of them have wheatgrass in. Yeah. Well, I'm sorry, but even if it's labeled gluten-free, when does the grain become the grass? And how can you officially 100% be confident that that's the case? And there was actually a product last year that was recalled that had wheatgrass in, that was labeled gluten-free, that wasn't gluten-free. So why risk it? So binders, fillers, emulsifiers, dispersing agents, instant coffee, brown rice syrup, energy bars, meat substitutes, salad dressing, sauces, gravies, soy sauce, Play-Doh. I mean, the list goes on. That's only a fraction of the list.
Yeah.
And so, the problem is it's educating. It's all about education to the client to say, well, look, this is not about simply cutting out bread.
No.
This goes a lot
going to
further
the free from aisle and going and stocking up on all those things either.
Absolutely. So let me give you an example. I have a new client I've just started working with who has been unofficially diagnosed as a celiac 30 years ago by a doctor. Okay, that was 30 years ago, quite some time ago. There wasn't as much knowledge or awareness then about celiac disease. Now, she has been so-called gluten-free for 30 years. But she ends up in my clinic because she feels really bad in terms of health. And she was the first client I actually suggested we should use Gluten Detect on. So she goes home and she does the Gluten Detect urine test and the stool test. And to her horror, she finds out she's not gluten-free on her current diet. So, this is somebody who believes she knows what she's doing, and for 30 years, 3 decades, has been pursuing this particular approach. And actually, she's been scuppering her well-being inadvertently by consuming something somewhere in the diet that has actually been causing her what's ended up with her coming to see somebody like myself in order to help her to unwind what is going on. Now, the compliance rates with a gluten-free diet, this is quite interesting actually, vary with age and sex, and they actually vary from as low as 17% to up to 80%, but it typically happens the older you become and the more male you are, the less likely you are to comply. Yeah? I don't know what it is about men, but there you go. Maybe I should be able to answer that since I'm an old man myself.
Because they want to drink, in my experience, it's because they want to drink beer.
Possibly. It's
All my
probably a
male
very good
parents
idea.
are like, no, not beer. Don't make me take beer away.
But yeah,
Just as an interlude on Gluten Detect, because I don't know who knows about Gluten Detect or who doesn't know about it, but just there are two different tests that are available that are a urine test, which is exactly like a pregnancy test, and also a stool test. And the urine stick test can pick up whether you've been exposed to gluten within the last 24 hours. And the stool test will look at exposure within the last 2 to 7 days. So I have also, as you have, sent it to a couple of I'm not fully seeing clients at the moment, but I've got some long-standing clients who I have great rapport with. So I sent them a couple of these kits because I wanted them to try as well. And both of them, one's celiac and one's non-celiac gluten sensitive, and both of them had positive results. The first one was negative and the second one was positive because she thought she had been exposed in a restaurant. So it's interesting. It's tough to avoid it.
Well, it's not just compliance rates, it's the fact that, again, the numbers on contamination, and of course this is inadvertent contamination. So again, I'm working with a celiac, officially diagnosed celiac, who has been struggling for some time until recently with his health. And you know, we've got down to the point that even when he goes to the butcher's to buy meat, you've got to be careful what the scales, have they been cleaned down before you put something on there to weigh it? Because actually, if you've taken something that's got breadcrumbs on it and you put it on the scales, and then obviously that gets contaminated with whatever you're weighing, that is a problem. You know, contamination across all kinds of kitchen utensils, toasters, scales, you name it, colanders. You know, this is a major issue. Looking at pots of jam, you know, and people using their knives in there, or or chopping boards, whatever it is, this is a big issue. Looking in restaurants, have they got separate facilities? What about the oil they cook the chips in? Is it the same as the stuff they cook the battered fish in? You know, this is a big one. So when you start looking at contamination rates, they range between 32 and 55%. So you can be complying, you can be doing everything you want to comply, but actually your intentions are being scuppered by something else that's often out of your control. I mean, it may be in your control, it may not be in your control.
Yeah.
But the point is that it can have an issue. And don't forget, it's not about, people seem to think, there's a myth that if you get contaminated, it's fine, you know, everything's fine, but you will show overt issues, i.e. you will be, you know, stomach cramps or diarrhea or whatever it is. No, 22% of celiacs are asymptomatic. You know, I've got a client coming in to see me next week, and he's a young man, and he is an officially diagnosed celiac, and we've just done a Ray 4 on the cross-reactive foods, okay? And he is, he's off the scale for those things, but he has no symptoms. The only reason he's coming to see me is because the mother wants to check out, you know, what's going on with the cross. She's smart enough to understand that there's a bigger thing going on here. Now, cross-reactive foods, we could talk another hour about cross-reactive foods. Now, that's not what we're here to do today, but, you know, maybe another day. But the point is that the whole world is rigged against you from the point of view of compliance. So if you are, imagine you are a refractory celiac, how on earth does one, without a test like this, how does one actually get to the bottom of what's going on? You know, are you being contaminated or are you not being contaminated? And therefore, why are you not getting better? So when you look at the data on healing, it's shockingly bad. 7 to 30% of celiacs on a long-term gluten-free diet continue to experience health problems. That's a huge, you know, the 30% error is huge. Only 8% of celiacs achieve complete healing of the villi on a long-term gluten-free diet. Now that means 16 months or more. 8%, so what about the other 92? So then you start looking at cross-contamination, yeah, whether compliance or whether it's cross-reactive food, which you said is another discussion, but you can start to use this test to actually whittle it down. You know, where are the problems? Where are the potential problems with this?
Yeah,
so,
where is that exposure coming from?
Yeah,
I mean,
so maybe
it does turn you into a detective because you've still got to work out where it's from, but at least it's keeping you in the straight and narrow, if that makes sense.
Well, Laura, let me add another little twist to this. Okay, what about personal care products? Okay, now the data here is really interesting actually when you look at the data, because people think, you know, okay, the general consensus is that you can't absorb gluten through the skin, yeah, because the molecule is too big and too complex, which it is. Yeah. They reckon it's just not possible to actually take it in through the skin. However, you can ingest it by accident. So when you look at this, I mean, it's some really interesting data on this. Personal care, beauty products, lip balms, lipsticks in particular, foundation, hand lotions. You know, if you put something on your hand and you don't wash your hands and then you eat something, there could be enough lotion on your hands to actually ingest it. So what they're saying is these things are problematic if you ingest them by accident. Now, apparently, this is not a certifiable source, okay, but this is a general view on lipstick consumption by women, you know, over their lifetime. Apparently, you ladies consume, and possibly some men, hundreds of lipsticks in your lives. I mean, it's just unbelievable, just because of the amount you put on the lips and then obviously what you consume. They reckon an average lipstick would contain 1.56 milligrams per day. Yeah, well, okay, that is under the so-called threshold. But what happens if you're refractory celiac? That is not tolerable. What about the shampoo you put on your long hair? I don't have trouble with this myself, but you know, on your long hair, and you by accident you get a strand of hair, which apparently can happen, in your mouth. You know, so you know, I'm taking it a little bit further here, but we need to be. It's about education. Education is absolutely fundamental, and when you start talking about these things in clinic to the client, they are absolutely gobsmacked. They really are transfixed because they want to be clean. They want to have better well-being. You know, that's what I tend to find. And if their attempts to become well are being scuppered, then they want to know why. And that is all part of the process.
So what's your strategy when people have been glutened, as it's known? What do you recommend to people? How do you quell that inflammation? Do you recommend enzymes? What's your strategy as a clinician?
Well, this goes back to the point, is simply taking gluten out of the diet good enough for a diagnosed celiac? And I would argue for a non-celiac gluten sensitive as well, you know, based on the figures we just talked about. The answer is no, because a lot of damage has been created. So, you know, as we know, it only takes a small amount of gluten to reignite the immune response and to continue the destruction, the inflammation, the oxidative damage, okay, that's going on. And maybe this is why, again, another study, poor vitamin status in over 50% of celiacs after 10 years of being on a gluten-free diet. 10 years. So what it tells you is that you've got to go in and heal and seal the gut. You've got to support the gut. You've got to repair the damage. You've got to find out what nutrients that particular individual is lacking. So do testing to measure nutrient status, you know, proper test, appropriate test for that nutrient. You know, magnesium status, red blood cell, all the things that we all know about. But do them because you see it time and time again. You see complete suboptimal status or deficiencies going on with minerals and vitamins, B vitamins in particular, elevated homocysteine levels, low iodine status, and amino acid status. This is a big one, you know, amino acids, the building blocks of life, you know, and you time and time again, obviously the correlation between gluten-related disorders and thyroid dysfunction is huge. We know that, okay, but often it's low amino acid status that is driving that.
So,
look at tyrosine.
So the good news is that Sheffield Hallam University, which is an NHS university, under Professor David Sanders, he's a specialist in gastroenterology and an advisor for Celiac UK, and he's running trials to use this test to see if it's a compliance issue or whether there's some other underlying issue as to why people are not getting better once they're celiac. So the data is coming, basically, which is always nice to hear.
It is, but I mean, again, I think we've already had a brief discussion about this. I mean, there are other things that are often going on. So, you know, dysbiosis, of course, is prevalent, which is one of the reasons. I mean, dysbiosis could be one of the key reasons why people develop gluten-related disorders in the first place. They don't have the toolkit to break down the protein. But then you look at small intestinal bacteria overgrowth. You know, these are big issues. You know, how often is SIBO even thought about in the overall clinical presentation of what is going on? And you know, absolutely. What about the genetic base HLA, DQ2 and DQ8? You know, the alleles there. I mean, this is really interesting stuff. So I tend to use multiple tests to build up a clinical picture. I then tend to write to the doctor, who completely ignores what I write, but I do it. and then we end up building up a picture which drives that client towards well-being, but by making sensible choices based on the data we have. And this is really important. I think the more I do what I do, the more obsessed I am with using data testing to drive clinical intervention.
Yeah. Well, hence why I do what I do as well.
But what's the point of guessing?
Over here.
Yeah, absolutely. But you know, who wants to guess at any of this stuff? You know, and why? How could you guess at nutrient deficiencies? Are you low in magnesium, zinc, or B vitamins, or whatever it is? You know, it's a huge subject, as you know, and a fascinating subject. But it is very important, and I think Gluten Detect is a key product, such a key product, and I'm really excited about using Gluten Detect in my clinic because I think you can validate, yes, somebody has slipped off track.
Yeah. And also for children when they're in a school environment, or one of my clients lives as a university, so she's in a shared house environment. She's doing everything. It's different toaster, different everything in her shared working environment. Sorry, it's a house, you know, she lives with friends. And so she's never sure where any cross-contamination is, because it's not like if you're in a family environment, you can probably encourage your whole family to be on the gluten-free journey with you. But if you're living with friends, that's probably going to be a harder situation.
Well, exactly.
So with regards to HLA, DQ2 and DQ8, we've had a couple of questions. So somebody has emailed in to say that they're negative for HLA, DQ2 and DQ8, which, as we know, predisposes you to being potentially more likely to develop celiac disease. But also for non-celiac gluten sensitive, it's about a 50-50 chance of whether you're going to be HLA, DQ positive or not. So they're negative for that, for those SNPs, but they have other autoimmune conditions, and they've come up with a whole load of gluten stuff positively. So the question was really about, would you label them as celiac disease or non-celiac gluten sensitive, despite not having any obvious gluten-related symptoms. So this is based off of the intolerance test. So I word things very carefully around this. So over to you. No,
I mean, and you're right to word things carefully, because this is not a deterministic test. It's not a diagnostic test. You know we cannot diagnose somebody on the back of the HLA DQ2 and DQ8 test. And we also know, because that's just on chromosome 6, we also know that there are a range of other genes that are coming into the equation that on other chromosomes that are also connected to the creation of a gluten-related disorder. But okay, what about non-celiac wheat sensitivity, which we just discussed? You know, maybe they're reacting to benzodiazepines, maybe they're reacting to the lectins, maybe they're reacting to the whole kernel of the grain. It's very difficult to be so precise about it, but what is for sure is that if they've got autoimmune issues going on, then just because of the zonulin pathway alone, you do not want to be touching gluten.
Yeah, well, agreed.
I mean, full stop. I mean, why would you want to tear down your defenses and expose yourself to your environment if you have any genetic susceptibility to developing an autoimmune condition or are presenting with autoimmunity?
Well, so on that note, we've also been asked another question about zonulin. So I know that from my studies of things that I've read around Alessio Fasano, which is not enough probably of all his work, but I think he was very worried at some point that he was saying that he was advocating an entirely gluten-free world and that nobody could tolerate it. And he says, actually, that's not what I'm saying. It's just that there are people who are susceptible to having increased intestinal permeability if they're not a fully healthy person, and if they have other things that might be, but basically they need to have a strong barrier permeability that won't necessarily only be affected by gluten, so it might be being knocked out by other problems as well, and this lack of genetic predisposition. So it's not the question that's been asked is does everybody have a, even in non-autoimmune individuals, does gluten have the same effect on zonulin in everyone? So yeah.
Okay. Well, to quote the man himself, Dr. Alessio Fasano, absolutely. You know, he's on record saying there is no single human on this planet that does not present with transient intestinal hyperpermeability, okay, when eating gluten. And the reason that we don't all end up with non-celiac gluten sensitivity, celiac disease, non-celiac wheat sensitivity, or wheat allergies, or whatever other gluten-related disorder you want to call it, okay, is exactly to do with the reasons that you stated, which is some of us have a genetic predisposition to autoimmunity, so HLA-DQ2 and DQ8, or HLA-B27, you know, for ankylosing spondylitis, and there's a whole raft of other genes. And obviously, the gut is the single largest interface between our environment and our genetics. So that is where the two join together. So if we have a genetic base that is weak in that particular area, and we are living a life that is not particularly clean, and we're marinated in toxins, and we're taking in bad foods, and we've got, you know, drinking too much, and we're smoking, and we're not exercising, and all the things that we know we should be doing, then every time you eat gluten, you are potentially stripping down for a few hours that barrier and allowing the environmental triggers, you know, part of the functional model of medicine, to potentially initiate the problem. So, and that's not the case with everybody, because as you say, it depends on the microfloral balance of that individual. You know, if the microfloral balance is strong, if you haven't got the genetic predisposition, if you're not stressed, if you know, if you're eating better and you happen to have the odd slice of sourdough, it's not going to be the end of the world.
Yeah. If you're not stressed, I'd love to meet those people.
Yeah. Just like us.
Yeah, never stressed. Never stressed over here. Never. So somebody has asked a question about a book that I have not read, so I don't know if you have read this. So what is your view about the idea from Dr. Osborne's book, No Grain, No Pain, that eliminating gluten is not good enough and that all grains should be avoided?
Right. Well, I think that it's a really interesting point. It's a fabulous question. And I'm going to talk about my wife, who doesn't mind me, by the way, talking about her condition. She says, please use it. I live with a celiac. My wife is a celiac. And my wife cannot touch any grains at all.
Wow.
Rice is a nightmare for her. You know, literally, we went out the other day to try and be normal, you know, go out and do a cup of coffee, you know, in town. And well, it's my idea actually. I thought, as in what I was going to tell you now, was let's have some coconut milk. Let's have a coconut milk latte, you know, let's go really wild. Yeah. And of course, I get carried away. I bounce up to the bar, order it, and I didn't check that the coconut milk whether it had rice flour in it. And I brought it back to the table, and within 30, honestly, this is no word of a lie. Within 30 to 45 seconds, she looked at me and she said, what is in this? And then she started getting this tight constriction across her chest. And within an hour, she had abdominal pain and cramping going on, just literally from the rice in the coconut milk. Now, we know through the tests, I've done the Cyrex test, we've been through a whole raft of things, as you can well imagine. And we know that she cannot touch any grains at all. She's literally got to be grain free. So the answer to that question is, you know, goes back to the point, is simply cutting out gluten good enough? As in, I know gluten is in all grains because it's the storage protein of all grains, but I'm talking about the bad gluten in barley, rye, and wheat. Mm-hmm. Is it good enough for celiac? No, it's not, because a lot of celiacs, and maybe this is why only 8% achieve full reparation of the villi, you know, is to do with cross reactions. You know, what other parts, you know, what other grains are causing problems? So we know, you know, I know that dairy, 50%, I know that's not a grain, but, you know, taking dairy aside, but dairy is 50% of celiacs cross-react casein. But then going back to corn's a big one, rice, millet. You know, millet is viewed as a gluten-free grain, but actually can be really problematic. What about gluten-free oats? Everyone goes, oh yeah, I can eat gluten-free oats because they're gluten-free. No, it's got nothing to do with the gluten-free aspect. It's the fact that you're eating oats.
Yeah.
So it's a big one. And I would say that when somebody is really on the back foot health-wise. Part of my protocols is to, for a time, take out all grains.
Right.
You know, lectin content, think about lectin, the impact of lectins on gut permeability.
It's very well documented.
It's very well documented. I'm not saying lectins are bad long-term, but of course, actually eating, you know, eating grains, certain grains for certain people can actually be a really good part of what they do, but we're all biochemically unique. We know that. We all react differently depending on the balance of our bacterial species in the gut, our genetic makeup, all the things that we've been talking about.
The gut, the gut, the gut.
The gut, the gut, the gut. Genes, 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 but connected to the gut through environment.
Biome.
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't think we've got anything else. We've had one question about where do you get the Gluten Detect from. So there is glutendetect.co.uk is the website for, and you can buy them there, both the stool kit and the urine kit. And so that's that reference. There is a link from the Regeneron site as well, but I think just go straight to glutendetect.co.uk. And in the absence of any other questions, I have been asked to say that our next webinar is going to be on Wednesday, the 21st of March, which is going to be about hormone balance with Labrix. So that will be another test-specific area. I don't know, Mark, have you got anything else you would like to add to anything that have we missed anything? I feel like we've done a pretty good analysis of everything.
Yeah, I think we've covered quite the big aspects of this. I just can't the message about how serious this is to health and well-being really must not be underplayed.
Yeah,
it is genuinely underplayed in society. You know, people don't view it. You know, certainly a sensitivity to gluten is viewed as it's just a little sensitivity. A bit of cake won't hurt you. No. This stuff can be really dangerous. It can be seriously dangerous and cause massive long-term problems, health problems. And I really feel we need to educate. We've got to get the education levels up with our modern allopathic friends. You know, we really do. This stuff is really serious to long-term health and well-being. I
agree. And I have to say, Robin Puglia is obviously part of the Regeneron team, but she also keeps me on the straight and narrow about gluten, and I do stray every now and then because I'm one of those people that doesn't have terrible symptoms, the gut related symptoms, so I think, oh, I'll be fine this time. And actually even this has been a reminder to me that I need to really pull myself back on the trail. If I can't do it, then my poor clients aren't ever going to do it. So we've had a number of people have just quickly written in saying, is it recorded? Yes, it is going to be recorded. I mean, it is recorded, and it will be, we will distribute it after the event to anyone who's been registered, and it will be up on our website also. Somebody has asked a brilliant question for which I absolutely do not know the answer, but it's how far away are we from having mobile test kits to test food for gluten before you eat it? No. So that would be wonderful for those people, but I don't know where that is.
No.
But it's a, you know, go make your millions, design that kit. Gosh, more people coming in.
My goodness.
Sorry, I don't see when. Oh, this is a nice question. When clients don't have funds for multiple testing, what would be your priorities in autoimmune type?
Well, the strategy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously not everybody can fork out £1,500 to £2,000 on testing across multiple areas. So you tend to, again, it goes on clinical presentation, but a lot of people can gain significant benefits from just being really well educated by the practitioner on what is going on here. So the majority of people don't even consider the fact that gluten could be hidden in the things that we talked about before. Instant coffee, really? You know, so you can make seismic differences to your clients' livelihoods if there's any risk of these issues being there by just giving them really sound education and giving them proper, constructive, detailed information about what they need to look out for, okay? So you don't have to test at all. Now, obviously, the beauty of Gluten Detect is that it's very cheap, you know, and you can do it at home and it's easy to do. So, of course, that's hopefully they can use Gluten Detect to actually then validate whether they're actually getting it right or not. But I tend to, it depends on the client. We're all driven by different things, aren't we, Laura? You know, some people love to see black and white data. Here we go, I've got a problem. This is what we got to do. Now, I've had clients who've said, look, we're going to test before we do the protocol, and we're going to test after the protocol, and I want to see what the protocol's done this. You know, other people don't.
Yeah.
And some people have got the money, some haven't.
And I've also had lots of people who have said, the test is not going to make any difference to me. I'll happily go gluten-free. And then they get so much better. And then they're like, oh, I wish I'd done it to start off with to see how bad it was.
Absolutely.
And you're like, you've got to reintroduce it. And I really don't want you to do that because we've got you so much better.
It's a really, actually, that's a really good point, because I do make a point of people when they're eating just normal diets and there's any hint of suspicion, I always ask the doctor to test, always. Yeah. Even though...
Which is exactly, at least you've got that, we've got that accessible to us.
It's possible they might pick something up.
Yeah. Okay, the other source that I think is brilliant is the Gluten Summit. So for anyone that's really interested in gluten as an area of just learning more and more and more and being given lists of things where gluten might sneak in, that you surreptitious sneaking in of gluten into things, then I would recommend that that's something that is become a gluten practitioner, as they say. So there are a couple of things coming in. I'm afraid due to time restrictions, we can reply to things online. If sorry, I'll email some replies for a couple of the last things that have come in. But Mark, thank you so much for your time, your wisdom, your expertise, your knowledge.
It's a pleasure, Laura. Pleasure indeed. Lovely to speak to you.
Lovely to speak to you, and we'll hopefully catch a lot of you on the 21st of March for the next one.
Let's hope so.
Everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.